Some stories begin with a question of what happened, but this one begins with a question far more unsettling. Who was she? Not how she lived, or even how her life ended, but simply what was her name? For 40 years, one of the most examined cases in American history was haunted by a void. In the official reports, she wasn't a person, she was a position. They called her the middle child. That label appeared in documentaries, courtrooms, and headlines. It was a practical way to distinguish her from the others found in the woods of Bear Brook, New Hampshire. But a label is not an identity. The youngest child was identified. The oldest child was identified. Even the adult victim was given her name back. But for 4 decades, the girl in the middle remained a ghost. She was the final gap in a narrative of absolute horror, a child whose DNA was a map that led nowhere. This wasn't a forgotten case, it was a benchmark for forensic science. Every time technology evolved, investigators returned to her. Every time a new breakthrough emerged, they hoped the middle child would finally be able to speak. In September 2025, the silence finally ended. The final piece of the Bear Brook puzzle clicked into place, and a name was spoken that had been stolen 40 years ago. Tonight, we step back into the shadows of the woods to understand why this truth demanded so much patience, and reveal, at last, the identity of the girl the world could only ever call the middle child. Bear Brook is not a city. It's 10,000 acres of quiet trails and New Hampshire wilderness. In 1985, a hunter found a 55-gallon drum. Inside were an adult woman and a young girl. For 15 years, the world thought that was the end of the tragedy. But in 2000, just 100 yards away, a second barrel was found. Inside were 2 more children. This was the moment the middle child entered the record. Unlike the others, forensic testing revealed a staggering complication. The middle child was the only one not biologically related to the woman in the first barrel. She was an outsider in her own tragedy. This detail didn't just complicate the case, it sent it into a tailspin that would take 20 more years to untangle. Why did she remain a mystery when the others were identified? It was a perfect storm of missing records. The man responsible for her death had lived under a dozen stolen identities: Curtis Kimball, Larry Vanner, Bob Evans. He had moved across the country, shedding lives like skin. To find the middle child's name, investigators didn't just need DNA. They needed to find a family who didn't even know she was missing. They had to navigate a labyrinth of 1980s false identities where every lead was a dead end. Before we continue with this chilling story, we will like you to subscribe and tell us where you are watching us from in the comments section. It will encourage us to do more and also help the algorithm to suggest our video to more people who like resolved cold cases like this one. Bear Brook State Park does not announce its history. It stretches quietly across New Hampshire, a place shaped by trees, trails, and the slow rhythm of seasons. Visitors come for walks, for fresh air, for moments of calm removed from daily routines. Families picnic, hikers pass one another with brief nods. Children run ahead on narrow paths, unaware of anything beyond the present moment. In the years before the discovery, Bear Brook was known only for this kind of ordinary peace. The park's landscape is dense and wooded, shaped by time rather than design. Tall trees form natural corridors. The ground rises and falls gently, softened by leaves and undergrowth. Streams cut through the terrain, their movement steady and unremarkable. It is the kind of place where sound is absorbed. Voices do not travel far. The world feels contained. This setting matters because it explains how something hidden could remain unnoticed for so long. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Bear Brook State Park was far less trafficked than it is today. There were fewer visitors, fewer maintained trails. Large sections of the park remained untouched, visited only by those who ventured away from established paths. It was within this quiet environment that the case began. At the time of the original discovery, there was nothing to suggest that Bear Brook held anything beyond what it appeared to be. No signs, no warnings, no indication that the ground itself carried a story waiting to surface. The discovery did not come from an organized search. It was not the result of an investigation already underway. It happened by chance, a moment of curiosity, a routine activity interrupted. When the barrels were first encountered, they did not immediately reveal their significance. Barrels, after all, are not unusual objects in wooded areas. They are sometimes discarded, sometimes forgotten, sometimes left behind for reasons that are never questioned. At first glance, there was nothing dramatic about them, but proximity invites attention, and attention leads to questions. As the barrels were examined more closely, it became clear that they were not empty, they were not debris, they were not refuse in the ordinary sense. Authorities were contacted. The response was measured, careful, and professional. Law enforcement understood immediately that this was not a situation to be approached casually. When officers arrived, the park's quiet atmosphere shifted. The wooded area became a controlled space. Movement slowed. Procedures took precedence. What followed was handled with restraint and precision. Inside the barrels were human remains. The discovery was factual, direct, and unmistakable. From the outset, investigators recognized that this was not a single individual. There were multiple sets of remains, requiring careful documentation and separation. The realization brought with it an immediate sense of gravity. This was not an isolated incident. This was not a recent event. The condition and placement of the barrels indicated that time had passed. How much time was not yet clear, but it was evident that the remains had been there longer than days or weeks. As the scene was secured, forensic teams began the process of examination. Each step followed established protocol. Every observation was recorded. Every detail mattered. The early assessment focused on classification. Investigators determined that the remains belonged to 4 individuals, 1 adult woman, 3 children. This classification alone shifted the scope of the case dramatically. Cases involving multiple victims require a different level of coordination. They raise immediate questions about relationships, timelines, and responsibility. Who were they? How were they connected? Why were they here? At this early stage, answers were limited. What could be determined was based on physical evidence and contextual clues. Age ranges could be estimated, general characteristics could be noted, but identity remained out of reach. The adult woman was recognized as such through established forensic indicators. Her presence suggested a caregiving role, a guardian, or a parental connection. The 3 children were of different ages, not infants, not adults, children. This fact alone carried emotional weight, even within the procedural language of investigation. Yet investigators were trained to remain focused on facts. Emotion could not guide conclusions. The barrels themselves became central to the investigation. Their type, condition, and placement were documented. Their location relative to trails and landmarks was mapped. Every detail was preserved because each detail held potential significance. At the time of the discovery, there was no immediate way to connect these individuals to missing persons reports. No clear matches surfaced in local records. This absence did not indicate a lack of effort. It reflected the limitations of the era. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Bear Brook State Park was far less trafficked than it is today. There were fewer visitors, fewer maintained trails. Large sections of the park remained untouched, visited only by those who ventured away from established paths. It was within this quiet environment that the case began. As news of the discovery became public, attention grew. Media coverage began cautiously, emphasizing confirmed facts while avoiding speculation. The park, once known only to local visitors, entered the national conversation. Bear Brook became more than a place. It became a case name. Interest intensified as details emerged. The presence of children among the victims drew widespread concern. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Investigators worked to establish timelines. How long had the barrels been in the park? Were they placed at the same time? Had they been moved? These questions were addressed through careful analysis of environmental factors and material condition. The conclusions suggested that the barrels had been placed deliberately and left undisturbed for an extended period. This understanding reinforced the complexity of the case. It was clear that whoever was responsible had taken steps to conceal the remains. The location was chosen not for visibility, but for isolation. Yet beyond this observation, little could be said with certainty. The focus shifted to identification. Without names, the case could not move forward. The adult woman and the 3 children each were assigned identifiers for record-keeping purposes. These identifiers were neutral, functional, and temporary, or so it was believed at the time. No one expected that one of these identifiers would persist for decades. The initial investigations extended beyond the park. Nearby communities were canvassed. Missing persons records were reviewed. Leads were followed, then exhausted. As weeks turned into months and months into years, the case remained unresolved. The discovery at Bear Brook had opened a door, but what lay beyond it remained unclear. What investigators did not yet know was that this case would evolve repeatedly over the coming decades, that it would be revisited as technology changed, that it would become a benchmark for forensic progress. At this early stage, the case was defined by absence. No confirmed identities, no clear narrative, only facts, carefully recorded and preserved. The adult woman and the 3 children existed in files and evidence logs. They were known through measurements, estimates, and classifications. They were known, but not recognized. This distinction is important. To know that someone existed is not the same as knowing who they were. And in Bear Brook, that gap would prove difficult to close. As the initial investigation reached its limits, the case entered a new phase. It did not end, it paused. Evidence was stored, records were maintained, the case remained open. This preservation would later prove crucial, because while the tools of the time could not answer every question, investigators understood that future advances might. The barrels were not forgotten. The remains were not dismissed. They were safeguarded, waiting for a moment when science could offer more. The discovery at Bear Brook was not a conclusion. It was the beginning of a process that would span generations, a process defined not by haste, but by persistence. And within that process, In the months following the discovery at Bear Brook, investigators turned their attention to what could be learned from the evidence itself. At that time, forensic science offered answers, but only within certain limits. The remains were carefully examined by specialists trained to extract as much information as possible without speculation. Every conclusion had to be supported by observable facts. Every estimate had to remain clearly labeled as such. From the beginning, investigators were able to determine approximate age ranges for the three children. These estimates were based on established methods, including bone development and physical indicators that science could reliably assess even then. The children were not all the same age. There was a clear difference between the youngest and the oldest. Between them was another child, close in age to neither extreme. This distinction mattered. It suggested order. It suggested family structure. It suggested that the children were likely related to one another rather than unrelated individuals brought together by chance. The adult woman's remains reinforced this assumption. Her presence alongside the children indicated a caregiving role. While investigators could not immediately confirm the exact nature of the relationship, the arrangement strongly suggested that these individuals had been part of the same household or family unit. This was an early conclusion, but it was an important one. Rather than four unrelated victims, investigators were likely looking at a group connected by daily life, a mother figure, and three children. However, beyond these broad outlines, details were difficult to establish. At the time, DNA analysis was not available in the form we know today. There were no national databases that could instantly compare genetic material across jurisdictions. There were no consumer genealogy platforms. There was no way to search family trees digitally. Identification relied heavily on missing persons reports, dental records, and physical comparisons. These methods worked well in some cases. In others, they led to dead ends. For Bear Brook, the latter proved true in the early years. Investigators reviewed local missing persons records first. When no immediate matches were found, the search expanded. Other states were contacted. Records were requested. Comparisons were made. Still, no clear connections emerged. This absence of matches raised difficult questions. Had these individuals been reported missing at all? Had reports been filed under different names? Had records been lost or misfiled? These possibilities were not unusual, especially in cases involving movement across state lines. Without centralized systems, information often remained siloed. What existed in one jurisdiction might not be visible in another. As time passed, the case entered a holding phase. Evidence remained preserved, files remained open, but progress slowed. Investigators documented what they could and acknowledged what they could not. The early forensic conclusions painted a partial picture. They suggested relationships. They suggested timelines. They suggested that these individuals had lived together before their lives ended, but they did not provide names. As years went by, the case did not disappear. It stayed present in investigative circles, revisited periodically as new methods became available. Each revisit brought renewed hope, and eventually that hope began to yield results. Advancements in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, changed the landscape entirely. What was once impossible became achievable. Through careful preservation of evidence, genetic material remained viable long after the discovery. This foresight allowed later generations of investigators to apply new techniques to old questions. The first identification marked a turning point. When one of the victims was identified, it demonstrated that the case could move forward. It confirmed that the effort invested over the years had not been in vain. Each identification that followed reshaped understanding. Names replaced placeholders. Histories replaced assumptions. Investigators were able to reconstruct portions of the victims' lives before Bear Brook. They could trace movements, establish timelines, and understand how these individuals came to be together. With each breakthrough, the story became clearer. The adult woman was identified. Her background provided context. It offered insight into how the family unit had formed. The youngest child was identified next. This identification reinforced the familial connection. It confirmed biological relationships that had long been suspected but not proven. The oldest child followed. Each time, the case shifted. Investigators could now speak with greater confidence about who these individuals were and how they were connected. Public understanding evolved as well. What had once been a vague and unsettling discovery became a documented family tragedy with identifiable people at its center. Yet even as these answers emerged, one gap remained. One child did not fit neatly into the growing narrative. She was not the youngest, she was not the oldest. She existed between them, both in age and in the sequence of identification. This distinction mattered. It suggested order. It suggested family structure. It suggested that the children were likely related to one another, rather than unrelated individuals brought together by chance. The adult woman's remains reinforced this assumption. Her presence alongside the children indicated a caregiving role. While investigators could not immediately confirm the exact nature of the relationship, the arrangement strongly suggested that these individuals had been part of the same household or family unit. This was an early conclusion, but it was an important one. Rather than 4 unrelated victims, investigators were likely looking at a group connected by daily life, a mother figure, and 3 children. However, beyond these broad outlines, details were difficult to establish. At the time, DNA analysis was not available in the form we know today. There were no national databases that could instantly compare genetic material across jurisdictions. There were no consumer genealogy platforms. There was no way to search family trees digitally. Identification relied heavily on missing persons reports, dental records, and physical comparisons. These methods worked well in some cases. In others, they led to dead ends. For Bear Brook, the latter proved true in the early years. Investigators reviewed local missing persons records first. When no immediate matches were found, the search expanded. Other states were contacted. Records were requested. Comparisons were made. Still, no clear connections emerged. This absence of matches raised difficult questions. Had these individuals been reported missing at all? Had reports been filed under different names? Had records been lost or misfiled? These possibilities were not unusual, especially in cases involving movement across state lines. Without centralized systems, information often remained siloed. What existed in one jurisdiction might not be visible in another. As time passed, the case entered a holding phase. Evidence remained preserved, files remained open, but progress slowed. Investigators documented what they could and acknowledged what they could not. The early forensic conclusions painted a partial picture. They suggested relationships, they suggested timelines, they suggested that these individuals had lived together before their lives ended, but they did not provide names. As years went by, the case did not disappear. It stayed present in investigative circles, revisited periodically as new methods became available. Each revisit brought renewed hope, and eventually that hope began to yield results. Advancements in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, changed the landscape entirely. What was once impossible became achievable. Through careful preservation of evidence, genetic material remained viable long after the discovery. This foresight allowed later generations of investigators to apply new techniques to old questions. The first identification marked a turning point. When one of the victims was identified, it demonstrated that the case could move forward. It confirmed that the effort invested over the years had not been in vain. Each identification that followed reshaped understanding. Names replaced placeholders. Histories replaced assumptions. Investigators were able to reconstruct portions of the victims' lives before Bear Brook. They could trace movements, establish timelines, and understand how these individuals came to be together. With each breakthrough, the story became clearer. The adult woman was identified. Her background provided context. It offered insight into how the family unit had formed. The youngest child was identified next. This identification reinforced the familial connection. It confirmed biological relationships that had long been suspected, but not proven. The oldest child followed. Each time, the case shifted.
Investigators could now speak with greater confidence about who these individuals were and how they were connected. Public understanding evolved as well. What had once been a vague and unsettling discovery became a documented family tragedy with identifiable people at its center. Yet even as these answers emerged, one gap remained. One child did not fit neatly into the growing narrative. She was not the youngest, she was not the oldest. She existed.
By the time investigators began to see clearer outlines of the family found at Bear Brook, another realization slowly came into focus. This was not an isolated incident. The individuals discovered in New Hampshire were part of a much wider pattern, one that stretched across years, across state lines, and across multiple identities used by a single person. That person was Terry Rasmussen. Rasmussen was not immediately known to investigators when the barrels were first discovered. His name did not appear in early reports. He was not listed in connection with missing persons cases tied to Bear Brook. At the time, there was no obvious trail leading directly to him. What existed instead were fragments, different names, different locations, different timelines that, at first glance, did not appear connected. It took years and advances in investigative methods to bring those fragments together. Rasmussen was a man who moved frequently. He lived in multiple states. He worked different jobs. He presented himself under different names. These aliases were not casual. They were deliberate and consistent. In some places, he was known by one name. In others, a completely different one. Records existed, but they were scattered. This mobility created significant challenges for investigators. When individuals move often and change identities, they leave behind incomplete records. Paper trails break, connections fade. In the years following the Bear Brook discovery, law enforcement agencies began comparing notes across jurisdictions. What initially appeared as separate cases started to share similarities. Patterns emerged. Investigators noticed recurring details, similar age ranges, similar family groupings, similar geographic movements. Slowly, these patterns pointed toward a single individual, Terry Rasmussen. The connection did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually as information from different states was combined. Records from California were compared with those from New Hampshire. Information from Arizona was reviewed alongside files from Texas. Each comparison added weight. Eventually, the evidence reached a threshold where investigators could say with confidence that Rasmussen was responsible for what happened to the individuals found at Bear Brook. This conclusion was not based on speculation. It was built on forensic evidence, documented movements, and confirmed identities. By the time Rasmussen's connection was established, he had already been linked to other cases involving family groups and children. This broader context changed how investigators viewed Bear Brook. The case was no longer seen as a single event. It was understood as part of a larger pattern of behavior. Rasmussen's use of aliases played a major role in how long the case remained unresolved. By presenting himself under different names, he avoided long-term scrutiny. By moving frequently, he reduced the chance that any one community would see the full picture. For the people around him, he appeared temporary. For investigators, he appeared fragmented. Only when his movements were mapped over time did the full scope become visible. Connecting Rasmussen to Bear Brook required patience and coordination. It required agencies to share information that, decades earlier, would have remained isolated. And it required the willingness to revisit old assumptions. Once Rasmussen was identified as responsible, the focus shifted again. Investigators began re-examining the family relationships with new understanding. They were no longer just identifying victims. They were reconstructing a family history shaped by control, movement, and secrecy. This reconstruction led to one of the most difficult revelations of the case. The middle child, the one who had remained unnamed for decades, was not just connected to Rasmussen, she was his biological daughter. This fact carried significant emotional weight. It reframed the case in a profound way. The middle child was not an unrelated child brought into the situation. She was not a stepchild whose records might exist elsewhere. She was Rasmussen's own child. This revelation answered one question while raising many others. Investigators now understood why her identification had been so challenging. As Rasmussen moved from place to place, he controlled how his family was presented. Birth records were limited. Official documentation was inconsistent. In some cases, children were registered under aliases. In others, records were incomplete or absent. The middle child's biological connection to Rasmussen meant that her identity was tied directly to a man who actively obscured his own identity. This created a unique obstacle. Normally, identifying a child becomes easier when a parent is known. In this case, it did the opposite. Rasmussen's history of false names and undocumented movement meant that traditional record searches led nowhere. No straightforward birth certificate to reference, no consistent surname, no stable address. For investigators, this was deeply frustrating. They knew who she was related to, they knew her role within the family, yet her name remained inaccessible. The emotional impact of this realization extended beyond the investigative process. For those studying the case, it highlighted the vulnerability of children whose lives are shaped entirely by the choices of adults. The middle child had no opportunity to establish her own identity separate from Rasmussen's control. Her name, her records, and her traceable history were all filtered through his actions. This reality made her anonymity feel heavier. She was known biologically, she was known contextually, but she was not known personally. Investigators spoke about her carefully. They understood that every mention reinforced her status as a person defined by absence. The fact that she was Rasmussen's daughter also complicated public perception of the case. Many people assumed that identifying her should now be straightforward. The truth was the opposite. The closer investigators came to Rasmussen, the more fragmented the records became. Each alias created a branching path. Each move introduced new uncertainty. And yet, the confirmation of her biological relationship kept the case alive. It provided direction. It told investigators where to look, even if the path forward remained unclear. The scope of the Bear Brook case expanded to its widest point, and within that scope, the middle child remained central, waiting, not as a mystery to be sensationalized, but as a person whose identity still needed to be returned. By the time investigators understood the full scope of the Bear Brook case, there was one figure who stood apart from all the others, not because she was less important, but because she remained undefined. She was not described by a name. She was not remembered through photographs or stories shared by relatives. She existed in the case file as a position, the middle child. This label did not emerge casually. It was born out of necessity. When investigators examined the remains found at Bear Brook, they were able to determine relative ages. They could see which child was the youngest. They could see which was the oldest. The remaining child fell between them, not the smallest, not the eldest. And so, in reports, she became the middle child. At first, the term was practical. It allowed investigators to distinguish between the three children when discussing evidence. It helped organize notes. It made communication clearer among professionals working the case. But as years passed, the label took on a life of its own. Media outlets adopted it. Documentaries repeated it. Articles referenced it as though it were a title. The middle child became a fixture in the language of the case. And with each repetition, the label served two purposes at once. On one hand, it kept her presence visible. It ensured she was not forgotten. On the other, it quietly replaced something essential, her individuality. A label can help structure an investigation, but it cannot tell a story. It cannot reflect a personality, a voice, or a sense of self. Over time, the middle child became known widely, yet personally unknown. Audiences learned the details of the case. They learned where she was found. They learned her estimated age. They learned her relationship to the others. But they did not learn who she was. This tension became one of the defining features of Bear Brook's legacy. Few cases had been examined so thoroughly while leaving one person unnamed. Investigators were acutely aware of this contradiction. They knew more about the circumstances surrounding the middle child than many other unidentified individuals. They knew her biological connection. They knew the environment she had been part of. They knew the broader context of her life. Yet her name remained beyond reach. As the years passed, the label began to feel increasingly insufficient. To the public, the middle child sounded almost abstract. It described a role, not a person. For those closest to the case, the label became a reminder of unfinished work. It represented the limits of the tools available at the time. And it raised a difficult question. How does a child remain known only by placement for decades? The answer lay partly in how investigations evolve. Early on, labels are functional. They help teams work efficiently. They reduce confusion. But when cases stretch across years and then decades, those same labels can harden. They become shorthand. And shorthand, while useful, strips away nuance. In this case, the label followed the middle child everywhere. In reports, in interviews, in public discussions. She became the one who was still missing, not physically, but on paper. As forensic science advanced, attention to the Bear Brook case increased. It was featured in documentaries that explored the complexity of the investigation. It appeared in long-form articles examining how technology reshaped cold cases. It became a frequent topic in podcasts focused on unresolved identifications. Each new feature brought renewed interest. Audiences learned how earlier identifications had been achieved. They learned about the methods used to connect family members. They learned about the obstacles investigators faced. And always, the middle child remained at the center, mentioned, acknowledged, yet unnamed. This created a unique kind of public awareness. People felt familiarity with her story, even though they did not know her name. They recognized the phrase "the middle child" immediately. They understood its significance within the case, but familiarity did not equal resolution. For many who followed the case, this was the most frustrating aspect. So much progress had been made. Science had identified victims who once seemed beyond reach. Technology had filled gaps that once appeared permanent, and yet one child remained undefined. The public response reflected this frustration. Viewers and readers often asked the same question: how could everything else be known, but not this? Investigators asked themselves the same thing. The answer was not a lack of effort, it was the complexity of her origin. As Rasmussen's biological daughter, the middle child's identity was tied directly to a man who had erased his own paper trail. Her birth may not have been recorded under his real name. Her early life may not have intersected with institutions that would create lasting records. In some cases, children born into transient situations leave behind very little documentation. That absence becomes more pronounced over time. Each year that passed without identification added another layer of difficulty. Witnesses aged, memories faded, records deteriorated or lost. And still, the middle child remained, present in every discussion of Bear Brook, absent from every registry. This duality shaped how the case was discussed publicly. She was both central and undefined, a symbol of how far the investigation had come and how far it still had to go. For some, the label became uncomfortable. It reduced a person to a category. For others, it became a call to action. The middle child was proof that even the most studied cases could hold unresolved truths. Her continued anonymity underscored why ongoing investment in forensic science mattered. Each documentary, each article, each podcast episode served another purpose. They kept the question alive. They reminded audiences that the case was not finished, that there was still a name waiting to be restored. This sustained attention helped ensure the case did not fade into archives entirely. It remained active in public consciousness, and that visibility mattered because identification often depends not just on technology, but on awareness. Someone has to recognize a detail. Someone has to connect a memory. Someone has to step forward. In the absence of a name, the middle child became known through collective memory. People who had never met her felt invested in the outcome. They followed updates. They shared information. They hoped for a breakthrough. Yet hope came with patience. Years passed without change. New forensic methods were introduced, but they did not immediately yield answers. Each advance brought optimism, followed by waiting. For investigators, this waiting was difficult. They knew the middle child deserved more than a placeholder. They understood that naming her would not change what had happened, but it would change how she was remembered. A name carries weight. It allows a person to exist in history as themselves, not as a description. The longer the middle child remained unnamed, the more symbolic her case became. She represented all the individuals whose identities were lost due to circumstance, movement, and lack of documentation. She reminded investigators and the public alike that progress in forensic science does not erase every barrier at once. Some answers take time, and some take persistence. By this stage of the Bear Brook case, public familiarity had reached a rare level. Many people could outline the investigation from memory. They could recount the major milestones. They could explain why the case mattered. But there was one detail none of them could supply: her name. This absence was not due to neglect. It was due to the limits of what was possible so far. And yet, even within those limits, the middle child remained present. She was discussed with care. She was referenced with respect. Her anonymity did not erase her importance. If anything, it heightened it. Because every time the case was revisited, it returned to the same point. One child was still waiting to be recognized as an individual, not as a label, not as a position, but as a person. And that understanding set the stage for what would come next, because science does not stand still, and neither did the effort to restore her identity.
For decades, the Bear Brook case stood as proof that effort alone is sometimes not enough. Investigators revisited files. They rechecked conclusions. They applied every available method of their time. Yet the middle child remained unnamed. What finally shifted the trajectory of this case was not a single discovery, but a change in the rules themselves. A transformation in how identity could be traced. This transformation came through genetic genealogy. To understand why this mattered, it helps to first understand what traditional DNA analysis could and could not do. Early DNA testing allowed investigators to compare one sample to another. If they had a known reference, they could confirm a match. If they did not, the DNA remained isolated, offering limited answers. For many years, that limitation defined the Bear Brook investigation. The middle child's DNA existed, but without a known individual to compare it to, the sample could not speak. Genetic genealogy changed that. Rather than asking, does this DNA match a specific person, it asked a different question. Who else might be related? Genetic genealogy works by identifying shared segments of DNA across large databases. These segments indicate biological relationships, sometimes close, sometimes distant, a cousin, an aunt, a grandparent's sibling. Each connection offers a clue. Public genealogy databases built by individuals curious about their ancestry became the foundation for this approach. People submitted DNA samples not for investigations, but to learn about their heritage. Over time, these databases grew large enough to reveal patterns of shared ancestry across families who had never met. For investigators, this created a new pathway. Even if a person had never been reported missing, even if their immediate family was unknown, even if records were incomplete, their relatives might still appear in these databases. This is why older cases became solvable in ways they never had been before. Time, which once worked against investigations, now worked in their favor. Each year, more people contributed their DNA to public platforms. Each new entry expanded the web of potential connections. Cases that had stalled for decades could be approached again, this time from the outside in. Rather than searching for the individual directly, investigators could build family trees backward. They could identify common ancestors. They could narrow branches. They could follow lines across states and generations. This process is meticulous. It requires patience, accuracy, and constant verification. But when successful, it restores something that once seemed permanently lost: a name. For the Bear Brook case, this shift reopened doors that had long been closed. The middle child's DNA was no longer silent. It could now be compared not just to one person, but to thousands. However, having access to genetic genealogy was only part of the equation. Interpreting the data required specialized expertise. This is where organizations like Firebird Forensics and the DNA Doe Project entered the story. These groups emerged at the intersection of science and investigation. They were built around one purpose: identifying individuals who had remained unnamed, sometimes for generations. Firebird Forensics specializes in advanced DNA analysis. Their work focuses on extracting usable genetic information from samples that may be degraded or incomplete. In older cases, this skill is essential. Time does not preserve evidence kindly. Yet Firebird Forensics developed methods that allowed older samples to be analyzed with greater precision than ever before. The DNA Doe Project, on the other hand, is known for its genealogical reconstruction. Their work centers on building family trees from DNA matches, often starting with distant relatives. They combine genetic data with public records, historical documents, and geographic information. Together, these organizations brought a level of focus and expertise that few agencies could maintain internally. They had already demonstrated success in other cases. Individuals once known only by descriptions had been identified. Families had been notified. Histories had been restored. But the middle child presented a unique challenge. This was not a case where a missing person report could be easily matched. Her biological father had lived under multiple names. He moved frequently. He left little consistent documentation. Her early life likely existed outside traditional systems that record identity. Birth records may have been incomplete or filed under an alias. School records, if they existed, may not have followed her across state lines. This meant the genealogical trail did not lead directly to her. Instead, it branched outward. Distant relatives appeared in databases, but their connection to the middle child was obscured by time and movement. Building a family tree in this context required extraordinary care. Each match had to be evaluated. Each branch had to be verified against historical records. A single incorrect assumption could lead the investigation in the wrong direction. This is why the case remained difficult even with modern tools. Genetic genealogy does not produce instant answers. It produces possibilities, and those possibilities must be narrowed through careful analysis.
For the middle child, this meant reconstructing a family history tied to a man who actively avoided traceability. It meant accounting for name changes, relocations, and gaps in documentation. It also meant recognizing that the child herself may have never had a stable identity in official records. Despite these challenges, the case moved forward. Firebird Forensics succeeded in generating a DNA profile suitable for genealogical analysis. That alone was a significant step. With that profile, the DNA Doe Project could begin its work. They examined matches, they identified shared ancestors, they constructed potential family lines. This process unfolded quietly and deliberately. Each connection was cross-referenced with timelines. Each hypothesis was tested against known facts of the Bear Brook case. Investigators did not rush. They understood the weight of what they were attempting to do. Identifying the middle child would not just close a case, it would rewrite part of its history. As the analysis progressed, patterns began to emerge. Certain family lines appeared repeatedly. Geographic overlaps became clearer. Historical records aligned in ways they had not before. Slowly, the range of possibilities narrowed. What had once seemed impossibly complex began to take shape. This stage of the investigation required sustained collaboration. Law enforcement agencies provided case details, forensic experts refined DNA interpretations, genealogists built and rebuilt family trees. Each discipline contributed a piece of the larger picture, and all of it hinged on one goal: to replace a label with a name. The middle child had waited for more than 40 years for this moment, not because the truth was hidden, but because the path to it required tools that did not exist. Genetic genealogy did more than offer a solution. It redefined what resolution could look like. Cases no longer depended solely on direct matches. They could now rely on the collective genetic footprint of families spread across generations. This shift changed expectations. Investigators began revisiting cases once thought unsolvable. Families began receiving answers long delayed. Communities saw identities restored where none had existed before. For the Bear Brook case, this technological change marked the beginning of the end of uncertainty. The case entered its final phase not through sudden revelation, but through methodical progress. Each step brought investigators closer to the answer that had eluded them for decades. And yet, even at this stage, nothing was assumed. The possibility of error remained. The responsibility to be accurate remained paramount. Before any name could be announced, every connection had to be confirmed, because a name carries consequences. It connects a person to a family. It enters official records. It becomes part of history. For the middle child, this meant that when her name was finally spoken, it had to be correct. Technology had changed the rules, but it had not removed the need for care. As Firebird Forensics and the DNA Doe Project continued their work, the case moved steadily towards resolution. What had once been a fixed absence now felt temporary. The question that had lingered for decades now had a clear direction, not if, but when. And soon that question would be answered. In September 2025, the middle child would no longer be known by position alone. She would be known as herself. But before that moment could arrive, there was one final step: confirmation. The kind that leaves no room for doubt. The kind that turns possibility into fact. And that confirmation would change the Bear Brook case forever.
By the time the Bear Brook case entered its final phase, there was no sense of novelty left in the work, only responsibility. The task facing investigators and forensic partners was no longer about discovery, it was about precision. Decades of effort had narrowed the field. Science had provided tools once thought impossible, and still the final answer required one more sustained push. Because genetic genealogy does not conclude with a single result. It concludes only after every other possibility has been ruled out. The DNA sample associated with the middle child had already traveled a long road, collected years earlier, preserved through changing standards, re-examined as technology advanced. Each time the sample was handled, care was taken to protect its integrity. But age introduces challenges. Time affects biological material. Environmental exposure leaves its mark. Earlier collection methods were not designed with future techniques in mind. This meant that even with modern tools, the sample presented limitations. The usable data had to be carefully extracted. Quality checks were repeated. Analysts worked within narrow margins. There were moments when the process slowed to a crawl, not because progress had stopped, but because accuracy demanded patience. Each genetic marker mattered. Each comparison had to be verified. A rushed conclusion would undo years of careful work. As genealogists worked through the data, they encountered what many long-term cases produce: dead ends. Family lines that seemed promising at first, only to dissolve under closer inspection. Connections that appeared strong, but failed to align with timelines or locations. This is the hidden reality of genealogical research. For every breakthrough, there are dozens of paths that lead nowhere. Each one must be explored before it can be dismissed. This is where persistence becomes essential. The middle child's case had already tested the limits of endurance. Investigators who began the work had retired. Others had taken over. Knowledge had been passed from one generation to the next. Now, in this final phase, the work required the same determination that had kept the case alive for so long. Genealogists returned again and again to the data. They rebuilt family trees from scratch. They reviewed public records with fresh eyes. They re-examined assumptions that had gone unquestioned for years. No detail was too small to revisit. Names mattered, dates mattered, places mattered, and in this case, aliases mattered more than anything else. The man responsible for the Bear Brook case had lived under many names. This created layers of confusion that extended into the genealogical record. Some documents reflected one identity, others reflected another. Some connections appeared unrelated until patterns emerged. Separating aliases from true lineage became one of the most demanding aspects of the investigation. Genealogists had to ask difficult questions. Was this record tied to a real person or to a name that existed only temporarily? Was this birth certificate accurate or filed under an assumed identity? Did this movement across states represent relocation or reinvention? Each answer required corroboration. Investigators relied on historical records, census data, marriage licenses, and other documents to piece together a coherent narrative. This process was slow, but it was deliberate. As the family tree narrowed, attention turned increasingly toward Rasmussen's known relatives. This step was unavoidable. DNA had already confirmed that the middle child was biologically connected to him. That fact reshaped the investigation. Rather than searching broadly, genealogists could focus on his extended family network. But even this focus introduced complications. Rasmussen's family history was not straightforward. Records showed multiple branches, some well documented, others fragmented. Some relatives had remained in one place for generations, others had moved frequently. This mobility created gaps. Children born in one state might have left few records before moving elsewhere. Name changes obscured connections. Time erased memories. Yet patterns began to surface. Certain relatives appeared repeatedly in the genetic matches. Shared DNA segments pointed toward specific ancestral lines. These lines were traced backward, then forward again. Slowly, the shape of the family tree changed. What once seemed like a tangled mass of branches began to separate into distinct paths. Some could be ruled out.
Dates did not align, locations conflicted, connections were too distant, others remained viable. And among those remaining possibilities, one absence stood out. A child who should have appeared in records but did not. A child whose estimated age aligned with the middle child. A child whose existence was hinted at but never fully documented. This kind of absence is meaningful in genealogical research. It suggests not a lack of existence, but a lack of records. For investigators, this was a turning point. The family tree no longer pointed outward in all directions, it pointed inward, toward a single missing link. This did not mean the work was finished, it meant the margin for error had narrowed. Every remaining possibility had to be examined in detail. Genealogists reviewed birth records from multiple states. They examined hospital logs, if available. They searched for informal documentation, mentions in letters, notes in family histories, fragments of memory recorded years later. Each piece of information was weighed carefully. Nothing was assumed. The risk of misidentification was ever present. In cases like this, the desire for resolution can create pressure, but investigators resisted that pressure. They understood that the final answer had to withstand scrutiny, not just today, but decades from now. As the analysis continued, corroborating evidence began to accumulate. Timelines aligned more closely. Geographic movement made sense. The absence in official records became increasingly consistent with what was known about Rasmussen's life during that period. The middle child was no longer an abstract figure. She was becoming anchored to a specific place in the family structure. At this stage, communication between teams intensified. Genealogists shared findings with forensic analysts. Law enforcement reviewed conclusions. Every claim was cross-checked. The goal was not speed, the goal was certainty. This process required emotional discipline. Those involved knew they were close. They also knew that being close was not the same as being correct. Each meeting ended with more questions to answer. Each breakthrough introduced new responsibilities. The weight of the moment was not lost on anyone. Identifying the middle child would close a chapter that had remained open for more than 40 years. It would also restore a name to a child who had never had one in the public record. As the final tree finally stabilized, one candidate remained, a child whose existence fit every known parameter, a child whose absence from records aligned with Rasmussen's movements, a child whose genetic connections matched the DNA profile. At this point, the work entered its most careful phase, independent verification. Multiple experts reviewed the findings. Alternative explanations were explored. Every assumption was challenged. This is the standard that defines responsible identification, not confidence alone, confirmation. As this process unfolded, the case stood on the edge of resolution. What had begun decades earlier with an unknown child was now approaching a conclusion grounded in evidence. The final step would require formal confirmation, official acknowledgement, documentation, and a name. But before that name could be spoken publicly, one last verification remained. Because in cases like this, there is no room for doubt. The middle child had waited long enough. When her identity was finally announced, it had to be undeniable. And so, as the final pieces fell into place, the Bear Brook case moved into its closing chapter, one defined not by questions, but by an answer that would arrive in September 2025, and with it, the end of a long journey toward recognition.
For more than 4 decades, the Bear Brook case carried an absence at its center. Not an absence of evidence, not an absence of effort, an absence of identity. By the late summer of 2025, that absence had narrowed to a single remaining step: confirmation. Not the kind that suggests likelihood, not the kind that implies probability, the kind that allows a name to be spoken without hesitation. Inside laboratories, the final phase of DNA analysis moved forward with quiet precision. There were no dramatic gestures, no sudden announcements, just process. Samples were rechecked, comparisons were repeated, independent reviews were conducted. Every result was evaluated against established standards. This stage mattered more than any other, because once the confirmation was complete, the story would change permanently. The DNA profile associated with the middle child was compared again to genealogical data. Each shared marker was verified. Each relationship was tested for consistency. Weeks passed, then more weeks. This waiting period carried a particular weight. For investigators, it was the culmination of years of work. For forensic specialists, it was the moment when analysis became conclusion. For the case itself, it was the final pause before resolution. When the confirmation arrived, it did not come with surprise. It came with clarity. The results aligned. Every independent check pointed to the same outcome. The middle child had a name. In September 2025, that name was formally confirmed: Rhea Rasmussen. With those two words, a label that had defined decades of discussion quietly disappeared. The middle child was no longer a position in a sequence. She was Rhea Rasmussen. The announcement did not come with spectacle. It came through official channels, stated carefully, supported by documentation. Investigators explained that advanced genetic genealogy, combined with thorough historical research, had led to the identification. They emphasized the collaborative effort. Firebird Forensics, the DNA Doe Project, law enforcement agencies across jurisdictions, each played a role. Each step had been necessary. When the name was released publicly, it carried a different weight than previous updates in the case. This was not a new theory, not a revised timeline. This was an identity restored. For years, the Bear Brook case had been discussed with familiarity. People recognized the details, they knew the framework, yet the absence of a name had always set the middle child apart. Now that absence was gone. Rhea Rasmussen entered the historical record not as an unknown child, but as a person whose existence could finally be acknowledged in full. The name itself did not answer every question. It did not explain her experiences. It did not describe her personality. It did not tell the story of her brief life. But it changed something fundamental. It allowed her to be recognized as more than a description. With confirmation came action. Official records were updated. Case files that once listed unidentified child were revised. Databases replaced placeholders with her name. Documentation that had carried ambiguity for decades now carried certainty. This process may sound procedural, but its impact is lasting. Records shape memory. They determine how cases are referenced. They influence how history is written. By updating these records, Rhea Rasmussen's identity became part of the permanent account. She was no longer an unresolved detail. She was acknowledged. Memorials connected to the case were also revised. Where once inscriptions or descriptions referenced an unnamed child, they now carried her name. This change mattered. Memorials are not just markers, they are declarations. They say, this person was here. For Rhea Rasmussen, this declaration arrived more than 40 years late, but it arrived. The emotional significance of naming cannot be overstated. A name is often the first gift given to a child. It connects them to family. It places them within a story. It allows others to address them as an individual. For decades, Rhea had been discussed without that gift. Now, her name allowed for a different kind of remembrance, one that recognized her as someone who belonged. Investigators spoke carefully about the moment. They emphasized that identification does not undo what occurred. It does not provide answers to every question, but it restores dignity. It affirms that the person mattered enough to be named. For those who had worked the case for years, this was the outcome they had hoped for. Not recognition, not acclaim, resolution. The middle child had been a symbol of unfinished work. Rhea Rasmussen became a symbol of what persistence can achieve. The announcement also marked a shift in how the Bear Brook case would be discussed moving forward. Future accounts would no longer reference an unnamed child. They would include Rhea by name. This inclusion matters not just for accuracy, but for humanity. It changes the tone of the narrative. It reminds audiences that this was not an abstract case study. It involved real people, real lives. For many who followed the case closely, hearing the name brought a quiet sense of completion. The question that had lingered for decades had finally been answered. Who was she? She was Rhea Rasmussen. This answer did not close every chapter, but it closed one that had remained open for too long. The process that led to her identification also carried broader implications. It demonstrated what modern forensic science can accomplish when paired with persistence. It showed that time does not have to erase identity. It reinforced the value of continued investment in cold case investigations. Because if Rhea could be identified after more than 40 years, so could others. The September 2025 confirmation became a point of reference, not just for the Bear Brook case, but for the field of identification as a whole. It showed that even the most complex cases can reach resolution when science and determination align. As records were updated and public understanding shifted, the Bear Brook case entered a new phase, no longer defined by an unnamed child, now defined by a restored identity. Rhea Rasmussen's name began appearing where once there was a gap, in reports, in articles, in discussions. Each appearance reinforced the same truth. She was no longer missing from the narrative. She was part of it. This change also altered how the case would be remembered in the future. Students studying forensic science would learn not just about techniques, but about outcomes. Journalists revisiting the story would no longer frame it around an absence. They would frame it around a resolution. And for those who had worked quietly behind the scenes, this mattered deeply, because the goal had never been to solve a puzzle. It had been to restore a name. In September 2025, that goal was achieved. The middle child ceased to exist as a label. Rhea Rasmussen took her place in history, not as a mystery, but as a person whose identity was finally acknowledged. And with that acknowledgement, the Bear Brook case reached a turning point, one where remembrance replaced uncertainty, where recognition replaced anonymity, and a name, long withheld by circumstance, was finally returned to the child it belonged to.
When a case reaches identification after decades, there is a natural temptation to believe that everything has now been resolved, that the story is complete. But identification does not rewrite the past. It does not alter what occurred. It does not restore lost time. It does not answer every question that history has left behind. What it does is clarify one essential truth: who the person was. In the Bear Brook case, that distinction matters. The identification of Rhea Rasmussen did not change the known facts of the investigation. It did not change the location where she was found. It did not change the timeline investigators had already established. It did not change responsibility, which had been determined years earlier. Those elements of the case remain exactly as they were. What changed was the lens through which the case is now viewed. For decades, the Bear Brook story included a blank space, 3 names, 1 absence. That absence shaped how the case was discussed. It framed the narrative around uncertainty. With Rhea Rasmussen identified, that imbalance no longer exists. The case now holds a complete set of identities. This does not mean that every aspect of Rhea's life can be reconstructed. Some details remain beyond reach. There are questions that time itself has made impossible to answer. Where exactly she was born, what she was called day to day, what moments of ordinary childhood she experienced. Those details may never be fully known. Records were not created, memories were not preserved, witnesses are no longer here to speak. This is the reality of cases that span generations. Time limits understanding, not because investigators stop caring, but because the world moves on. People age, documents disappear, opportunities for clarity narrow. Even with modern science, some aspects of the past remain incomplete. Identification does not erase those gaps, it simply defines them more clearly. Before, the middle child represented an unknown person. Now, Rhea Rasmussen represents a known person whose life remains partially undocumented. That distinction matters. It shifts the conversation from speculation to acknowledgement, from guessing to remembering. The Bear Brook case also reminds us that identification is not the same as closure. Closure is personal. It varies from person to person. For investigators, closure may come from knowing the work was done thoroughly. For the public, it may come from seeing a long-running case reach resolution. But for the individual whose name was restored, identification serves a different purpose. It affirms existence. It places them back into the human record. For Rhea Rasmussen, this affirmation arrived long after her life ended, but it arrived nonetheless. The case also clarifies something broader. It demonstrates what perseverance can achieve, not quickly, not easily, but eventually. The Bear Brook investigation did not move forward in a straight line. It advanced in stages. Each generation of investigators contributed what they could with the tools available to them. When those tools were insufficient, the case paused. When new methods emerged, it moved again. This pattern reflects a truth about many long-term cases. They wait. They wait for technology. They wait for data. They wait for connections that have not yet formed. This waiting is not passive. It is sustained by people who refuse to let unanswered questions disappear. The Bear Brook case survived because it was revisited repeatedly, because it mattered enough to return to, because someone always believed that the remaining question could still be answered. That belief proved correct. Yet even now, with Rhea Rasmussen identified, the case does not offer total clarity. It offers perspective. It shows how much can be learned even after decades, and it shows how much can still remain unknown. This balance is important. It prevents the story from becoming simplified. The Bear Brook case is not a tale of instant resolution. It is a reminder of how complex identity can be when records are fragmented and lives are lived outside stable systems. It also underscores the role of science as a tool, not a solution by itself. Technology made Rhea's identification possible, but technology alone did not carry the case forward. People did. Researchers who spent countless hours building family trees, analysts who re-examined DNA samples again and again, investigators who refused to consider the middle child a permanent label. Their work ensured that when technology reached the necessary point, the case was ready. The legacy of Bear Brook is therefore layered. It is a case study in forensic advancement. It is a lesson in persistence, and it is a reminder that every unidentified individual represents a missing chapter in history. Rhea Rasmussen's identification changes how the case will be remembered in the future. She will no longer be referenced as a role or a position.
She will be referenced as herself. This matters for how history is written. It matters for how future investigators learn from the case, and it matters for how society understands the importance of naming. Names are not just labels, they are connections. They tie people to families, to stories, to memory. Without a name, a person can fade into abstraction. With a name, they remain part of the human record. As this case reaches its final moments, it leaves behind a quiet but powerful message. Some cases wait for technology. Some children wait for names. And sometimes, even after decades, those names can still be restored. The Bear Brook case does not end with every question answered. It ends with something more fundamental: recognition. Rhea Rasmussen is no longer defined by where she fell in a sequence. She is no longer reduced to a placeholder. She is no longer spoken of in terms of absence. She is named. She is acknowledged. She is remembered. And that remembrance is the true legacy of this case. Not mystery, but identity. Not anonymity, but recognition. Rhea Rasmussen is no longer the middle child. She is named. She is remembered.